Hello, everyone. My name is Ayelet Har Even. I'm a PhD student at the University of Haifa, Israel. I'm grateful for the opportunity to present the research Professor Ayelet Har and I conducted. The research subject is narrative persuasion through transportation into songs and affective responses. The last 2 decades have seen a growing interest among communication researchers in persuasion through transportation into narratives. The narrative in these studies is commonly presented in a written text or a movie. In the current research, we studied changes in attitude following exposure to narrative presented in songs. The obvious question is why? Why do we think that a song is different from a written text or a movie? And the answer is because song may not work like any other media. How is it different? It's commonly very short. It includes a melody and often doesn't contain a clear message. It is not clear how these characteristics might affect the ability to be transported into songs and persuaded by them. Moreover, in contrast to books and movies, people are often exposed repeatedly to songs, which can potentially increase their ability to be persuasive. Such repeated exposure especially characterizes songs that are related to annual historical events, such as Memorial Days. Thus, in the current research, we examine persuasion through transportation into songs that are commonly heard during Holocaust Memorial Day in Israel. The songs that we analyzed tell the story of the Jewish people who suffered during World War II. The attitudes that are conveyed in these songs' narratives are open to interpretation. They can promote, on the one hand, nationalistic attitudes, such as the significance of the State of Israel as a shelter for the Jewish people, or they can promote universal attitudes, such as the importance of preventing other people from the suffering as the Jewish people had. There is some evidence that exposure to songs can lead to changes in attitudes and behavior. For example, exposure to a Lady Gaga song that promotes the genetic explanation of homosexuality led listeners to accept this explanation and report more positive attitudes about homosexual people. Similarly, exposure to antisocial music increases violent behavior. While exposure to pro-social music enhances empathy and the tendency to help. The common explanation for the effect of songs on changes in attitudes and behavior is the priming mechanism. In other words, the ideas that are presented in the song make related ideas more accessible in the mind of the media consumer. In the current research, we suggest an alternative explanation for the persuasive effect of songs that is related to transportation into the song's narrative. Transportation refers to the deep involvement of the media recipients with the narrative to the degree that they forget about their own real world and enter the world of the narrative. When people are transported or immersed in a narrative, it encourages them to align their attitudes with the attitudes in the narrative. Studies have documented that this experience has a positive effect on the enjoyment of the narrative and promote acceptance of the attitudes it conveys. We examined how transportation into the songs that are commonly heard on the Holocaust Memorial Day in Israel change nationalistic and universal attitudes among people of various political orientations. Likewise, these songs can arouse various emotions. We examined which emotions the transportation arouses, since emotions could lead to persuasion. They can lead to anger and the desire for revenge, but they can also lead to compassion for suffering people. Based on previous research, documenting a correlation between political attitudes and emotional responses, we hypothesized that left-wing people would respond to the songs with compassion, while right-wing people would respond to them with anger. Moreover, we hypothesized that feeling of anger in response to the Holocaust songs would strengthen nationalist attitudes, while feeling of compassion would enhance universal attitudes. Method. We conducted an online experiment. The participants were contacted by the internet survey company Panel for All and paid for their participation. Only Jewish participants were contacted because they were the focus on the current research. 1,059 participants answered the questionnaire, which included 2 items that tested the attention the participants paid with. Those who did not answer these questions correctly were eliminated from the analysis. Likewise, we also eliminated from the analysis participants who did not listen to the songs entirely, participants who were too fast or too slow completing the questionnaire, and participants who did not understand the topic of the song. Ultimately, 685 participants remained in the analysis, 361 women and 324 men, whose ages range from 18 to 55. Procedure. The participants were first asked to report on their mood and political attitude. Then they were randomly assigned to one of 5 experimental conditions: exposure to an audio clip that included the lyrics of one of 2 Holocaust songs, exposure to these clips while being asked to perform an interfering task to reduce transportation, exposure merely to the lyrics of one of the songs, exposure to information about the Holocaust from Wikipedia, and a control group that was not exposed to any stimulus. So, following that, the participants were asked to answer a questionnaire that contained items measuring transportation, the emotion that were aroused by the songs, and nationalist and universal attitudes. Measures. The transportation scale was based on Green and Brock and included 13 items, to which the participants responded on a scale ranging from 1 to 7. We created an index from the mean of these items, with higher values indicating greater transportation. The emotions scale included anger, revenge, fear, mercy, and the desire to help others. The answers to these items were on a 1 to 5 scale, with higher values indicating more emotional responses. We created an anger index from the first 2 items and compassion index from the last 2. The nationalist attitudes included 6 items, such as every effort must be made to protect and strengthen the Jewish people from generations to come. The answers to these items were on a 1 to 7 scale, with higher values indicating more agreement with the items. We created an index from the mean of these items. Lastly, the universal attitudes included 6 items, such as a people who have been through the Holocaust, we must be sensitive to refugees and asylum seekers and help them. The answers to these items were also made on a 1 to 7 scale, with higher values indicating more agreement with the item. We created an index from the mean of these items. H1 was exposure to a song with a melody would result in more transportation than exposure to a song without a melody, lyrics only. To examine H1, we conducted t-tests. The experimental condition, either read or listen to the song, was the independent variable, and the level of transportation was the dependent variable. We found that the mean transportation to a song with a melody is significantly higher than the mean transportation to a song without a melody, lyrics only. H2 was exposure to a song on the Holocaust will lead to more support for national and universal attitudes comparing with no exposure to the song. To examine H2, we performed one-way ANOVA analysis. First, we examined the effect of the independent verbal exposure or non-exposure to the song on the dependent verbal support for national attitudes. In contrast to the hypothesis, a significant main effect was not found for exposure. The mean for the responses to the support, the mean of the responses, to support national attitudes among respondents exposed to the song was not differ significantly from respondents not exposed. However, according to the hypothesis, a significant main effect was found for the independent verbal exposure or non-exposure to a song on the dependent verbal support for universal attitudes. The mean of the respondents to support universal attitudes among respondents' exposure to the song was differed significantly from the respondents not exposed. Consistent with this finding, H2 was partially confirmed, only relating to universal attitudes. H3 was right-wing people who would respond to the Holocaust song with anger, while left-wing people would respond to them with compassion. H4 was being the right-wing as opposed to left-wing will lead to nationalist attitude following exposure to the songs through the mediation of the feeling of anger in response to the song. To examine H3 to H5, we conducted two mediation analyses using process, an SPSS macro designed by Hayes. We included political attitudes, right-wing or left-wing, as the independent variable, the two affect indices as the mediators, and either the nationalist attitudes or universal attitudes as the dependent variables. Political orientation predicted feeling of anger in response to the songs, such as right-wing participants felt more anger than left-wing participants. The response of anger also predicted nationalist attitudes. Moreover, initial political orientation indirectly led to nationalist attitudes through the mediation of the response of anger to the song. Compassion did not mediate the effect of initial political orientation on nationalist attitudes. H5 was being left-wing as opposed to right-wing will lead to universal attitudes following exposure to the songs through the mediation of the feeling of compassion in response to the songs. Likewise, we found that political orientation predicted feeling of compassion in response to the songs, such that left-wing participants felt more compassion than right-wing participants. In addition, the response of compassion predicted universal attitudes. Moreover, initial political orientation indirectly led to universal attitudes through the mediation of the response of compassion to the songs. Anger did not mediate the effect of initial political orientation on universal attitudes. These findings indicate the contribution of the melody to transportation. In addition, it indicates that people interpret the same message subjectively, which corresponds to their initial political orientation, and that the same message activates different emotions among them. Thank you very much.